Well, good morning, everyone, and it's really great to be with you again. Advent. I love Advent. Why do I love Advent? Well, I love Advent because I love Christmas. Now, not everybody loves Christmas, but I love Christmas. I think probably because when we were growing up, we used to have great Christmases at home, and I'm kind of reliving those happy moments of my childhood. Now, of course, we all know that Advent is not meant to be just a series of chocolate squares that you get out from little doors in an Advent calendar. In fact, it'll be a shock to some of you, the younger ones amongst us. When I was growing up in about the 16th century, there was no chocolate Advent calendars. They were just, you open the little door and you had a little picture, or maybe you had a verse or something like that, you know. But I still loved Advent calendars because every door was one door nearer to the big day. But the thing about Advent is it's not just a kind of frothy time of chocolate and tinsel. We're meant to be preparing our hearts for the fact that God became a human being, and we're going to celebrate that. And one way to do that is to look at some of the characters of the story, which is what you're doing. Try and put ourselves in that situation, maybe work out what we would have done when faced with those challenges, learn from what they did. So last week, I gather you looked at Mary. This week, we're looking at Zechariah. Mary's, well, the word says kinsman, so by marriage. So we don't quite know what the relationship is, probably cousin or maybe brother-in-law, something like that. And if you want to sum up what you can learn from Zechariah, I think there's two big things we can learn. The first is that all of us, even the most faithful people, can get things wrong. But the second thing is that God is a God of second chances. Now, for those of you who heard my talks before, you know it only takes about 15 seconds before I show you a picture of the Holy Land. So here is a picture. Got that picture? There we are. So that is the temple at Jerusalem at the time of Jesus' birth. It's not the actual one, because that was destroyed in 70 AD. It's a famous model at the Israel Museum in West Jerusalem. And it's a fantastic model. And this was the center of Jewish life in Israel at the time of Jesus' birth. And 3 times a year, as many of you will know, all observant Jewish men were supposed to go up to Jerusalem to celebrate the feasts. But actually, temple worship went on the rest of the time. There was a rota of priests available to do the daily sacrifices and to burn incense. And you might have thought that offering incense was a kind of everyday thing for priests. I mean, some churches use incense today. They use them for every service, But it wasn't an everyday thing for people to burn incense. The population of Palestine was then about 500,000-600,000 people. There were about 18,000 Levites and priests. And those priests, half of them, say maybe 9,000-10,000 priests, they were divided in 24 divisions. And you can read all about this in Chronicles, 1 Chronicles. And these divisions of priests, these 24 divisions, they served as priests in the temple in rotation, twice a year. So maybe each division had 300 or 400 people in it, and they got only twice a year for a week. So if you do the maths, you realize that there's only a few key jobs. This burning incense is one of these key jobs. Only a few people ever got to do this. And as you can imagine, they were really keen to do this key job. And so the way they did it, the team for the day, about 50 in each team, and they all drew lots. And if your white stone came out, you burned the incense for the day. And it wasn't a public event, actually. The priest went through the curtain, through those doors, up the steps, through the doors there. Okay, it's a curtain. And then he goes into the holy place. And the holy place, those curtains there's some more curtains, and those behind the curtains was the Holy of Holies. And the high priest only went in there once a year in Yom Kippur. So this place in front of the Holy of Holies is called the holy place. They had the menorah, the big 7-branch candlestick. You can see it there on the left of the picture. And there was an altar of incense. And the priest offered incense to the Lord. And he was completely alone, just him and God. And it was such a high duty that a priest was only allowed to offer incense once in a lifetime. Such a privilege. And so most of them never ever got to do it. Now actually, in Israel, in the old the old city of Jerusalem, there's a place called the Temple Institute, where they've got a bunch of ultra-Orthodox Jews that want to rebuild the temple on the Temple Mount, where the Dome of the Rock, the Islamic shrine, is at the moment. And they started to assemble modern replicas of all these things. And look, there we are. That is a modern replica of the altar of incense. It's covered in real gold. Acacia wood covered in real gold. You can use it for incense. And they're hoping they're going to be able to rebuild the temple. Now, the trouble is, they've never read Hebrews, which tells them that it's a complete waste of time, and God doesn't want them to do that anymore. But there you go. That's what they want to do. Anyway, so if you ever go to Israel, ever go to the Old City of Jerusalem, go to the Temple Institute. It's really fascinating, though I disagree with their theology. Anyway, let's get back to Luke chapter 1. There we go. The priest is allowed once in a lifetime to go into burn incense, and one day Zechariah's number comes up. So, what's the significance of this for us? Well, let me just share a quick aside with you first, which is about the date of Christmas. Now, some of you might have heard this before. Now, we know when Christmas is, okay? It's in the little hymn, in the bleak midwinter, frosty wind made moan, earth was hard as iron, water like a stone. Famous poem by Christina Rossetti, become a famous carol. I'm not sure it's quite right, okay? It can snow in Israel in the middle of winter. The trouble is, I don't think Jesus was probably born in the middle of winter. The chances are he was born around September. Now, how do we know that? Well, let me explain. Luke chapter 1 begins with the annunciation by the angel Gabriel to Jesus' uncle or kinsman Zechariah that he will have a son. We read that together. He eventually becomes John the Baptist. It happens when Zechariah is serving as a priest in the temple. Luke chapter 1 verse 5 says he was of the division of Abijah, one of these 24 divisions. They're all listed in 1 Chronicles. Okay. In around 3 or 4 BC, when Jesus was thought to have been born, the division of Abijah was serving in the temple in June. Well, he did it twice a year, but in particular in June. And then Luke then says, well, Zechariah comes home and his wife becomes pregnant. So the clock starts ticking from there. And then we know from verse 26, it was in the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, the angel Gabriel comes to announce to Mary that she's going to be pregnant. So, in other words, John the Baptist is going to be 6 months older than Jesus. Okay? So Jesus is likely to be born 15 months, if you do the maths, 15 months after John was conceived. So if he's conceived in June, if you add 15 months to that, Jesus is born in September. Okay? So one possible date for Jesus' birth, I've read, is around September 22nd to the 28th, 3 BC. Sorry, the person who's worked out the AD BC got it wrong, all right? So Jesus was definitely born before Christ, okay? And it's possibly during the Old Testament Feast of Tabernacles, okay, which is Sukkot, which is in September. And one of the reasons why it doesn't seem very likely Jesus was born in the bleak midwinter is because we know there were shepherds in the fields keeping watch of their flocks by night. We know that bit, don't we? Okay. Well, it's really freezing in December in Israel. You don't keep, on the whole, you don't keep sheep out in the field at that time of year. You keep them in a pen, but out in September, it's nice and warm and toasty. That's the kind of, you be out with the sheep. Now, it is fair for me to say there are some people who think biblically you can show that Jesus was born around December the 25th, all right? But I don't think it's that likely. So the bad news for people like me who love Christmas is we've already had it. 3 months ago, we didn't celebrate it. But if that's true, the good news is you can go home and eat all the chocolates from your Advent calendar now, because it's already happened, okay? Right, let's see how Zechariah takes the news he's going to be a father. So the first thing is that this angel appears to him and he's terrified. Now, if you go to nativity plays, we know what angels look like. They look like small children with wings and halos and tinsel and stuff, don't they? Okay. But actually, in the Bible, almost everyone who meets an angel is terrified. Mary, the shepherds, Joseph, Zechariah too, they all react with fear. Because angels are seriously scary people. They look scary. They're tall, they're intimidating. There's no reference to them having wings, I don't think, actually. They're cherubim. They're a different class of people. They just look big, scary people. And in fact, the text uses words with Zechariah. He was agitated or distressed or terrified or disturbed, Because Zechariah knew that angels only ever turned up when God had something important to say. And that important thing was not always good news. So back, for example, in 1 Chronicles 21, an angel appears to King David to bring a plague of judgment on people. So you can't blame Zechariah for being a little bit terrified. But he's got good news. The thing that Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth had longed for years was about to happen. They were going to have a son. And this was an amazing news because back in ancient Israel, there was incredible stigma attached to the condition of childlessness. Elizabeth said, God has taken away my disgrace. And it was the woman who assumed it was her fault. But incredibly, the prayers of many years, decades probably, for Elizabeth and Zechariah about to be answered. And not only that, this child was going to be one foretold in the Old Testament, in Old Testament prophecy. This is what Gabriel says to Zechariah about the son. Verse 16, he will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God. He will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. Which is actually a direct quotation from the Old Testament, from the last book of the Old Testament, the prophecy of Malachi, written about 400 years before these events. And in it, Malachi prophesies that God is going to visit his people. But before he does, he's going to send the prophet Elijah to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers. And actually, Jesus later identifies this John the Baptist as this person. And actually, that's exactly what John grows up to do. He comes as a forerunner, as a herald of Jesus himself. So this is fantastic news. So what does Zechariah do with this amazing news? Well, he completely bottles it, really. He loses it. He can't believe what he's been told. Even though an angel, for goodness sake, has turned up to tell him, he says, well, how can I be sure? I'm old, my wife is old. I mean, how's this going to happen? And he learns right away, this is not the moment for faithlessness. And God, through his angel, decides to teach him a lesson. And he makes him dumb and able to speak for 9 months. And the angel says, you're going to stay dumb until the baby's born because you didn't believe my words. Which on the face of it does seem a bit harsh, really. I mean, it's not like Zechariah had the information broken to him gently. He goes into the temple for this supreme moment of his ministry as a priest. And this angel turns up out of the blue and gives this bombshell news. And I think I would have had trouble grasping it too. But 2 things I want you to take away this morning. The first is, the purposes of God are not thwarted by our lack of faith. The purposes of God are not thwarted by our lack of faith. Of course, if we have faith, it helps for us to tune into God's purposes, to participate in what he's doing. But whether we have faith or not, God's purposes are still going to take place. Look, when Jesus was arrested and crucified, none of his followers had faith that he'd be raised to life again. They'd already been told about it, but I bet standing there on Good Friday, they didn't think that. They said, well, no problem, a couple of days, he'll be back. They didn't think that. They scarpered. They were terrified. But God's purposes were still fulfilled. And then the people of Israel standing on the shores of the Red Sea, Pharaoh's army bearing down on them, they thought they were toast. They thought they had no faith at all. Moses was the only one. But God had a different plan. And when we look at the world today, it looks like it's in a real mess. But let's remember that God is in control, however we feel. I turned on the news this morning, and maybe some of you have as well, to hear about the news about Syria. Have you heard about what's happening in Syria? Okay, so I've been to Syria. Has anybody been to Syria? Okay, I've been to Syria. I went to Syria in 2010, the year before the war. And we drove from Beirut to Damascus. And as soon as we passed the border, there were massive pictures of Bashar al-Assad and his father, Hafez al-Assad. And those were the thugs that had been running Syria since about 1982. And they are awful. Hafez al-Assad, the father, is even worse than the son, which is saying something. And the family ran this as a kind of family business. Okay, they made large sums of money. They put people in prison. They tortured them. Okay, and then this incredible civil war has broken out, and Bashar al-Assad caused his army to drop barrel bombs on people. They wrecked. I've been to Aleppo, which is a beautiful place, the biggest covered market in the Arab world, completely wrecked. Awful. And he's finally gone. Now, I'm concerned about what's going to replace him. Can I just say that? We need to keep praying for Syria, because at the moment it's an Islamist, fundamentalist, terrorist group who are leading this rebellion. But they are well shot of Bashar al-Assad. But over those years, those decades, people must have prayed for him to go, and they thought, no, it's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. But actually, I believe it's God's purposes to remove this man. Okay. So it's the fact we don't have faith, the fact we find faith, we're losing faith maybe, or we can't hold on, or times are dark, or we're scared, doesn't mean that God's purposes will not be fulfilled. And that's exactly what happened here. God was going to bring about the fact that Elizabeth and Zechariah were going to have a child. They prayed for it for years and years and years, and nothing had happened. But his purposes were fulfilled. And they happened afterwards. He still didn't have faith, did he? Zechariah. He still didn't have faith. But they went home and conceived anyway, didn't they? He didn't say, well, we won't, let's not go too personal here. But he said, well, let's not bother going to bed because it's never going to happen, is it? There's no suggestion, by the way, this was a virgin birth or anything. They did have a child normally. But, they required a bit of cooperation on their part. And they did. They did, however old they were. By the way, that's why I'm not totally pessimistic about the Church of England, which is a total mess. But I haven't lost faith for a biblical Church of England, because I believe ultimately God will have his way. So for Zechariah, the fact that he didn't believe didn't stop God's purposes coming about and him and his wife conceiving. But there is something else, which is that God is a God of second chances. Now, I'm not actually surprised that Gabriel struck Zechariah with dumbness during his wife's pregnancy, because something extraordinary is happening. And Elizabeth was going to conceive in her old age, have a child in circumstances that seemed impossible. And what she didn't want is God taking her through this, which required a lot of faith, and somebody like Zechariah standing next to her, undermining her faith and trust. She needed to hang on to God. She didn't need Zechariah sitting there cynically saying, well, I don't know, I still don't know whether you're going to make it to full term. Yeah, can you imagine? The best thing to do is to shut him up, which is exactly what God did. But wonderfully, God gives him a second chance, because the baby's born, and it's a boy just as the angel had promised. And it comes to naming the child, and the conventional thing would be to give him the name of his father. And Elizabeth and then Zechariah insist on giving him the name John, just as the angel Gabriel had said. Can you see, ultimately, Zechariah is faithful. God gives him a second chance, and when he steps out in faith and does what God told him to do, suddenly he's able to come out with this extraordinary song of praise, which the church has called the Benedictus, which is said actually in morning prayer every morning. I'd say morning prayer most mornings. I say this prayer, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who's come to his people and set them free. It's a fantastic psalm of praise. My experience is that God does that all the time for you and me. Have you ever had the experience of messing up? Is it only vicars and clergy who mess up? I don't think so. We all mess up from time to time. We all sin. We all let God down. We say wrong things. We hurt people by the things we do. And if God was not a God of second chances, I wouldn't be standing here today. But gloriously, he is. So, let's learn from Zechariah and his experience. We don't always get it right first time. But gloriously, the Lord will have his way, whether we express faith and whether we get it right or not. But also gloriously, we are nearly always given a second chance. And time again, the Lord says, well, should we rerun history? Should we do it again? Should we give it another go, Andrew? And gloriously, he comes in healing and forgiveness and restoration. So let's just pray. Can we just pray?